Hi, I'm Maya. When I walked into TechForward's annual investor gala wearing my grandmother's pearl necklace and a navy dress I'd bought on clearance, they whispered behind their champagne flutes. Failed soldier turned wannabe entrepreneur. Pathetic. My former supervisor, Marcus, just smirked like he'd been proven right all along. The venture capitalists I'd pitched to last month turned away when they saw me. And Rebecca, TechForward's Golden Girl CEO? She announced loud enough for half the room to hear that some people just don't know when to quit chasing impossible dreams. But what none of them knew was what I'd been building in silence for the past 18 months. Because when the acquisition papers were signed 3 days later, and I walked back into that same building as their new owner, the laughter died in their throats. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Pacific Ballroom at the Grand Hyatt downtown sparkled like something out of a business magazine. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white silk, each centerpiece a careful arrangement of orchids and eucalyptus that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Seattle's tech elite moved through the space with practiced ease, their conversations a blend of startup jargon and casual mentions of seven-figure valuations. I stood near the registration table, smoothing down the fabric of my dress for the third time in 10 minutes. The navy blue sheath had seemed appropriate when I'd tried it on at home, but here among the designer gowns and perfectly tailored suits, it felt like wearing armor that was 2 sizes too small. My grandmother's pearls, the only expensive jewelry I owned, felt heavy against my collarbone. They'd belonged to a woman who'd raised 6 children during the Depression, who'd understood the value of persistence when everything seemed stacked against you. I touched them gently, drawing strength from their familiar weight. Maya Rodriguez? The voice belonged to Jennifer Walsh, a tech journalist whose byline I'd been reading for years. She approached with a recorder already running, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. I heard you were planning to attend tonight. Brave choice, considering. I kept my expression neutral. Considering what exactly? Well, the rumors about your last pitch meeting with Coastal Ventures. Word is you claimed you'd build an empire that would revolutionize logistics, that you'd be bigger than Amazon within 5 years. She tilted her head like a bird spotting prey. Some people found that rather ambitious for someone with your background. The registration volunteer, a young woman with perfectly highlighted hair and a Stanford MBA pin on her blazer, looked up from her tablet. "Excuse me, I don't see your name on the guest list. Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the confirmation email I'd purchased my ticket with my last credit card with available balance. Maya Rodriguez, table 47. She frowned at the screen, then at me. "Oh, that's in the back section, near the kitchen doors." Her tone suggested I'd somehow confused charity work with a real invitation. Jennifer Walsh's eyes lit up with obvious delight. "Table 47? Isn't that where they usually seat the +1s and scholarship recipients?" She didn't bother lowering her voice. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the combination of a journalist's attention and what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable moment. I recognized several faces from LinkedIn profiles and industry publications. These were people who controlled millions in funding, who decided which startups lived or died with a single meeting. Maya? Marcus Chen emerged from the crowd, his expression a mixture of surprise and poorly concealed amusement. He'd been my supervisor during my brief stint at TechForward 2 years ago, back when I'd been desperate enough to take a junior analyst position that paid barely enough to cover my studio apartment rent. "I didn't expect to see you here." Marcus wore success like an expensive cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. His tailored suit probably cost more than I'd made in a month at TechForward. The Rolex on his wrist caught the chandelier light as he gestured, and his perfectly styled hair suggested regular visits to salons I couldn't afford to walk past. "Hello, Marcus." I kept my voice steady, professional. "How's the new product line? Performing?" He laughed. the sound carrying just enough volume to ensure our growing audience could hear. Still asking the smart questions, I see, though I have to wonder if you're asking them in the right places. His eyes traveled over my dress, my shoes, my grandmother's pearls with barely disguised judgment. I heard through the grapevine that you've been making some pretty bold claims about your little venture. The crowd pressed closer. I caught fragments of whispered conversations, my name mixed with words like delusional and military discount. Someone behind me murmured something about veterans who couldn't adjust to civilian life, who thought their service entitled them to instant success in fields they didn't understand. Bold claims? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. Come on, Maya. Empire building? Revolutionizing supply chain management? You pitched to 3 different firms last month and got turned down by all of them. Marcus's smile was all teeth, no warmth. Look, I respect what you did overseas. Really, I do. But this isn't a battlefield. This is business. And business requires more than determination and good intentions. Jennifer Walsh stepped closer, her recorder practically vibrating with anticipation. Marcus, are you referring to the pitch where Ms. Rodriguez claimed she'd developed proprietary AI algorithms that could optimize delivery routes better than existing systems, among other things? Marcus turned back to me, his expression shifting to something that might have been pity if it weren't so condescending. Maya, you were a good analyst, detail-oriented, hard-working. But there's a difference between following orders and creating strategy, between executing someone else's vision and building your own company. A woman in a silver cocktail dress that probably cost more than my car joined the conversation. I didn't recognize her, but her posture and the way others deferred to her suggested money, influence, or both. Excuse me, but did I hear correctly? You're claiming to have developed AI technology? I am developing AI technology, I corrected quietly. She exchanged a look with Marcus that spoke volumes. With what team? What funding? What infrastructure? Her questions came rapid fire, designed to expose the gaps in my resources. Do you have any idea what it costs to build the kind of technology you're describing? The talent required? The computing? Power alone would cost millions. More people had gathered now, forming a loose circle around us. I felt like an animal in a zoo, something exotic and slightly pathetic that people studied from a safe distance. The conversations around us had quieted, other guests straining to hear what was clearly becoming the evening's entertainment. I understand the challenges, I said, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my cheeks. Marcus laughed again, louder this time. Challenges? Maya, you're talking about competing with companies that have billions in funding and teams of PhD, computer scientists. You worked in supply chain analysis for 8 months before you quit to chase this fantasy. What makes you think you can build something that Google and Amazon haven't already perfected? The silver dress woman nodded sagely. I've seen this before. Military veterans often struggle with the transition to entrepreneurship. The structured environment of service doesn't always translate to the creative chaos of building a startup. She spoke about me as if I weren't standing right there, her tone clinical and detached. Some people just don't understand their limitations, someone else added from the crowd. There's a difference between confidence and delusion. I felt my hands clench at my sides, my grandmother's ring pressing into my palm, the same ring she'd worn while working 3 jobs to support her family, while refusing to accept charity, while building something from nothing through sheer force of will. I thought about the 18 months I'd spent in my studio apartment, coding until my eyes burned, testing algorithms on servers I'd cobbled together from secondhand parts, surviving on instant noodles and determination. Perhaps, Jennifer Walsh said, her journalistic instincts sensing blood in the water, you could tell us more about this empire you're planning to build? What exactly does success look like in your vision? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around me, I could feel the weight of their skepticism, their amusement, their absolute certainty that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a former soldier playing dress-up in a world where I didn't belong. They saw my clearance dress, my modest jewelry, my table in the back near the kitchen doors, and they thought they understood my story. Marcus crossed his arms, his smile widening. Yes, Maya. Tell us about this empire. Help us understand how someone with no funding, no team, and no real experience in tech development plans to revolutionize an industry that some of the smartest people in the world have been working on for decades. The circle tightened around me, their faces expectant, hungry for the moment when I would crack under the pressure of their combined doubt. They wanted to see me stumble, to confirm their assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. But what they didn't know, what none of them could see, was that I'd already built something that would change everything, something that would make this moment, this humiliation, this assumption that I was just another failed veteran, chasing impossible dreams, look very different in retrospect. I touched my grandmother's pearls one more time, smiled, and began to speak. I cleared my throat and looked directly at Marcus, then at the expectant faces surrounding me. You want to know about my empire? I kept my voice calm, steady. It starts with understanding that logistics isn't just about moving packages from point A to point B. It's about predicting human behavior, optimizing for variables that most people never even consider, and creating systems that learn and adapt. In real time. The woman in the silver dress raised an eyebrow. That sounds like marketing speak. What does it actually mean? It means, I continued, that while companies like Amazon focus on speed and volume, they're missing opportunities for efficiency that could cut costs by 30 to 40%. While improving delivery times, my algorithms don't just find the fastest route, they predict demand patterns, weather disruptions, traffic anomalies, and human behavioral changes to create delivery networks that think 3 steps ahead. Marcus let out a snort of laughter. Maya, you're describing fantasy technology. The amount of data processing required for what you're talking about would need infrastructure that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Would it? I asked quietly. Or would it need someone who understands how to build elegant solutions instead? Of brute force approaches? Jennifer Walsh leaned in closer with her recorder. Can you give us a specific example of how your system would work differently? Before I could answer, a new voice cut through the conversation. Oh, this should be good. Rebecca Martinez had arrived, TechForward's CEO and the evening's keynote speaker. She moved through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea, her presence commanding immediate attention. Everything about Rebecca screamed success. The custom-fitted black gown that probably cost more than most people's cars, the diamond earrings that caught the light with every movement, the confidence that came from never having to question whether she belonged in any room. Rebecca, Marcus said, his voice warming immediately. Perfect timing. Maya here was just explaining how she's going to revolutionize logistics with some kind of magical AI system. Rebecca's smile was razor-sharp. Maya Rodriguez. I remember you from the TechForward days. You lasted, 8 months before you decided corporate life wasn't for you? 7 months and 3 weeks, I corrected. But who's counting? I am, Rebecca said smoothly, because in those 7 months and 3 weeks, you submitted 47 different optimization proposals for our supply chain operations. 47. Do you know how many we implemented? The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I felt my face flush but kept my expression neutral. I believe it was 3. 3, Rebecca confirmed, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. And do you know why we only implemented 3 out of 47 of your brilliant ideas? I didn't answer. I knew she was going to tell me anyway, because the other 44 were completely impractical. Expensive to implement, impossible to scale, and based on theoretical models that sounded impressive on paper but fell apart the moment they encountered real-world complexity. Rebecca turned to address the crowd now, using me as a teaching moment. This is what happens when someone with limited industry experience thinks they can solve problems that companies spend millions of dollars trying to address. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering. Several people nodded knowingly, the kind of sage wisdom that comes from watching others fail from a safe distance. Maya always had big ideas, Marcus added, piling on. The problem was that she never understood the difference between having an idea and executing it. She'd come into meetings with these elaborate presentations about optimization theory and behavioral prediction models. But when we asked about implementation costs or scalability concerns, she'd just say we weren't thinking big enough. Thinking. Big is important, said the woman in silver, but so is thinking realistically. The military teaches planning and execution, but it doesn't teach market analysis or customer acquisition or the 1,000 other things you need to actually build a successful company. Jennifer Walsh was practically vibrating with excitement at the story unfolding in front of her. Ms. Rodriguez, how do you respond to these concerns about the practicality of your approach? I looked around the circle of faces, all of them waiting for me to defend myself, to justify my presence in their world, to prove that I deserved to be taken seriously. Behind Rebecca, I could see other guests craning their necks to get a better view of what was clearly becoming the evening's main entertainment. I respond, I said slowly, by saying that sometimes the most practical solution is the one that looks impossible from the outside. Rebecca laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Vague, inspirational, nonsense that sounds profound but means absolutely nothing. She turned back to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why due diligence matters. This is why we ask hard questions about business models and revenue streams and competitive advantages, because anyone can stand up and claim they're going to build an empire, but building something real requires more than motivational quotes and military discipline. Speaking of building something real, Marcus said, clearly enjoying himself now. Didn't you pitch to Coastal Ventures last month? How did that go? The question hit like a physical blow. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for that pitch, practicing in front of my bathroom mirror, refining my presentation until every slide was perfect. I'd borrowed a suit from my sister, printed my materials at a Kinko's because my home printer had died, and walked into that conference room believing I was about to change my life. They passed, I said simply. Passed, Rebecca repeated, savoring the word. After you told them you'd have a working prototype within 6 months and be profitable within 2 years. Is that correct? That's correct. And Elevation Partners? How did that meeting go? I felt my jaw tighten. They also passed. And Meridian Capital? 3 for 3, I admitted. The crowd exchanged glances that ranged from sympathetic to embarrassed to openly amused. Here was proof of what they'd suspected all along. I was just another dreamer who'd confused confidence with competence, determination with delusion. 3 major VC firms, Rebecca said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. 3 firms with decades of experience identifying promising technologies and business models. And all 3 of them concluded that your empire-building plans weren't worth investing in. She paused for effect. But I'm sure they just didn't understand your vision, right? Maybe they didn't, I said quietly. Marcus shook his head, his expression shifting from amusement to something that might have been genuine concern. Maya, listen to me. You're a smart woman. You have skills, determination, a strong work ethic. But this fantasy about building some kind of logistics empire is going to bankrupt you. You could have a good career in this industry if you'd just accept your role and work your way up like everyone else. Work my way up where? I asked. Back to TechForward? Back to being the person who submits 47 proposals and watches 44 of them get dismissed without serious consideration? Those proposals were dismissed because they weren't viable, Rebecca said firmly. We're not in the business of implementing every interesting idea that crosses our desks. We implement solutions that work, that scale, that generate real value for our clients. And how do you measure real value? I asked. Revenue, said the woman in silver immediately. Profit margins, market share, customer acquisition costs. The metrics that actually matter in business, not theoretical efficiency gains that exist only in computer models. Exactly, Rebecca agreed. Which brings us back to the fundamental question. What exactly have you built so far? You've been out of the corporate world for over a year now. You claim to be developing revolutionary technology. So where is it? Where's your prototype? Where are your test results? Where's your proof of concept? The questions came like artillery fire, each one designed to expose the gaps in my story, the holes in my preparation, the fundamental weakness of my position. Around me, the crowd pressed closer, feeding off the energy of a public dismantling. I've been working, I said. Working where? Marcus demanded. In your apartment? With what resources? What team? What funding? I've been working alone. The silence that followed was deafening. Then someone in the crowd actually laughed out loud, quickly stifled but audible enough to make my cheeks burn. Alone, Rebecca repeated, her voice dripping, with disbelief. You're trying to revolutionize logistics. Alone. In your apartment. With no funding, no team, no infrastructure, and no industry partnerships. She turned to the crowd again. This, everyone, is what delusion looks like. The word delusion hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't put out. I felt my hands trembling slightly, so I clasped them behind my back where no one could see. The circle around me had grown larger, more people drawn by the spectacle of watching someone's dreams get dissected in public. Their faces blurred together into a sea of expensive clothes and knowing smiles. The kind of expressions people wear when they're witnessing a car accident, they're grateful not to be part of. But Rebecca's dismissal triggered something deeper than embarrassment. It pulled me back to another moment, 3 years earlier, when I'd first learned that sometimes the people who claim to support you are the ones who hurt you the most. I'd been 26 then, fresh out of my second deployment in Afghanistan, sitting in a sterile Veterans Affairs office in downtown Seattle. The counselor across from me had been kind but frank about the realities of transitioning to civilian life. The skills you learned in the military are valuable, she'd said, shuffling through pamphlets about job placement programs and educational benefits. But you'll need to adjust your expectations about where you fit in the private sector. The pamphlets all featured the same kinds of jobs: security guard, warehouse supervisor, logistics coordinator. Steady work, decent pay, clear hierarchies that would feel familiar to someone used to military structure. Nothing wrong with any of it, but nothing that felt like the future I'd imagined during those long nights in Kandahar when I'd planned what I'd do when I got home. Have you given any thought to what kind of work interests you? The counselor had asked. I want to solve problems, I'd told her. Big problems. I want to build something that matters. She'd smiled the same way Rebecca was smiling now, indulgent, but skeptical. That's admirable. But let's start with something realistic. What about supply chain management? Companies are always looking for people who understand logistics, and your military experience would be directly relevant. So I'd followed her advice. I'd taken the job at TechForward, grateful for the opportunity, determined to prove myself. For 7 months and 3 weeks, I'd thrown myself into the work with the same intensity I'd brought to everything in the Army. I'd studied their systems, identified inefficiencies, proposed solutions that could save time and money while improving service. And I'd watched, proposal after proposal, as my ideas disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of corporate decision-making. The few that were implemented were always stripped down, simplified, robbed of the elegant complexity that made them effective. The rest were dismissed with phrases like, not scalable, or too ambitious, or outside our current strategic focus. The breaking point had come during a quarterly review meeting. I'd prepared a comprehensive analysis of TechForward's delivery network, complete with predictive models that could reduce failed deliveries by 23% while cutting fuel costs by 18%. I'd spent weeks on the presentation, modeling every variable, accounting for every potential objection. Marcus had listened politely, asked a few perfunctory questions, then set my report aside with the others. "Interesting work, Maya," he'd said. "We'll definitely take this under consideration." After the meeting, I'd lingered in the conference room, gathering my materials, when I'd overheard him talking to Rebecca in the hallway outside. "What do you think about Rodriguez's latest proposal?" Rebecca had asked. "Same as always," Marcus had replied, his voice carrying clearly through the half-open door. "Technically sound, but completely impractical. She doesn't understand that we're not running a research lab here. We need solutions that we can implement next quarter, not theoretical models that might work perfectly in some imaginary world where customers behave predictably and traffic patterns never change." "It's the military background," Rebecca had said, with authority. "They're trained to think in terms of perfect information and optimal outcomes. But business is messy. Markets are chaotic. You can't solve real-world problems with elegant equations." "Exactly. Plus, she has this intensity that makes clients uncomfortable, like she's trying to prove something instead of just doing her job. I've had 3 different account managers mention it. Maybe we should consider moving her to a more structured role. Something where her analytical skills would be useful, but she wouldn't be client-facing. Or maybe she'd be happier somewhere else entirely. Some people just aren't cut out for corporate culture." I'd left TechForward the next week, turning in my resignation letter with the same precision I'd once used to file mission reports. Marcus had seemed genuinely surprised, asking if there was anything they could do to change my mind, any adjustments to my role that might make me more comfortable. Told him no, thank you, that I'd decided to pursue other opportunities. I hadn't mentioned that I'd heard their conversation, hadn't explained that I was leaving, not because I couldn't handle corporate culture, but because I refused to accept their definition of what was possible. Standing in the ballroom now, surrounded by the same kind of skepticism I'd faced in that conference room, I felt the familiar burn of being underestimated. But this time, it came with something else. The knowledge that I'd spent the last 18 months proving them wrong. "You know what the real problem is?" Rebecca continued, her voice pulling me back to the present moment. "It's that some people confuse having strong opinions with having expertise. They think that because they can identify problems, they can automatically solve them. But identification and solution are completely different skill sets." Jennifer Walsh nodded eagerly, clearly delighted by the quotable material. "That's an interesting distinction. Can you elaborate on that?" "Of course," Rebecca said, warming to her theme. "In my experience, people from military backgrounds often excel at analysis and process improvement within existing systems. They're great at making things work better. But creating something entirely new, building a company from scratch, that requires a different kind of thinking. It requires understanding markets, customer psychology, competitive dynamics, regulatory environments. It requires accepting that your first dozen ideas will probably fail and having the resilience to keep iterating." Marcus nodded sagely. "And it requires being honest about your limitations. Maya, you've been out of the workforce for over a year, burning through whatever savings you had, chasing this dream of building an empire. When do you admit that maybe it's time to try a different approach?" The question hit harder than I'd expected, because it echoed the voice in my head that whispered doubts during the long nights when my code wouldn't compile, when my algorithms produced garbage results, when I lay awake wondering if everyone else was right and I was just too stubborn to admit it. "I mean," Marcus continued, "what's your plan if this doesn't work out? Do you have a backup? Because at some point, idealism has to give way to practicality." "That's the thing about empire builders," said the woman in silver, her tone suggesting she'd seen this story before. "They never have backup plans. They're all in on their vision, which sounds romantic until you're 35 and starting over from scratch because you spent your prime earning years chasing fantasies." The crowd murmured agreement. These were practical people, successful, People. People who understood the value of measured risks and diversified portfolios. They'd built their careers by making smart, incremental choices, by understanding their markets and their limitations. "I'm curious," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a final verdict. "What exactly convinced you that you could succeed where so many others have failed? What made you think that your military experience prepared you to compete with teams of PhD computer scientists and engineers who've been working on these problems for decades?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around me, the crowd waited for my answer, their expressions ranging from curious to pitying to openly dismissive. I could feel the weight of their expectations, their certainty that I would either admit defeat or double down on delusions they'd already seen through. Jennifer Walsh leaned forward with her recorder, sensing that this might be the moment when the whole facade collapsed, when I finally acknowledged the gap between my ambitions and my abilities. But what they didn't understand, what none of them could see, was that their dismissal had been my greatest teacher. Every rejected proposal, every condescending smile, every assumption about my limitations had taught me something valuable. That sometimes the biggest advantage you can have is being underestimated by people who think they already know your story. Took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everyone's attention like a physical pressure on my chest. "What convinced me," I said slowly, "was watching a convoy get ambushed outside Kandahar because our supply algorithm couldn't predict that insurgents would adapt their attack patterns based on our delivery schedules. The casual chatter around us died completely. Even the background noise of the gala seemed to fade as people strained to hear what I was saying. 3 soldiers died that day because our logistics system was built on the assumption that route optimization was just a math problem. Speed plus efficiency equals success. But nobody had programmed the system to account for human intelligence on the other side, for enemies who learned from our patterns and used our predictability against us." Rebecca's expression shifted slightly, the smug confidence flickering. "For just a moment. That's a tragic story, Maya. But I'm not sure how it relates to civilian logistics." "It relates," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "because that's when I realized that every system I'd seen in the military and in the corporate world was making the same fundamental mistake. They were optimizing for variables they could measure while ignoring the ones they couldn't predict. They were building solutions for a world that existed only in spreadsheets." Marcus crossed his arms, his skepticism intact. "So your solution is what, exactly? Build systems that can read minds?" "My solution is to build systems that understand that human behavior isn't random. It's just complex." I turned to face the crowd more directly, feeling something shift inside me. When I was deployed, I spent 18 months studying how insurgent networks adapted to our tactics. I mapped their decision trees, their resource allocation patterns, their communication protocols, and what I discovered was that what looked like chaos from the outside was actually highly sophisticated system adaptation. "That's interesting anthropology," said the woman in silver. "But how does that translate to commercial applications?" Before I could answer, a new voice cut through the conversation. "Because she's talking about evolutionary algorithms that can model adaptive behavior in real time." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of our circle, her MIT credentials and reputation in artificial intelligence lending immediate weight to whatever she said next. I'd read her papers, followed her research, but I'd never imagined she'd be at this gala, much less listening to my impromptu presentation. "Dr. Chen," Rebecca said, her voice carefully controlled, "I didn't realize you were here tonight. I arrived a few minutes ago and couldn't help overhearing your discussion." Dr. Chen moved closer, her attention focused entirely on me. "Ms. Rodriguez, when you say you're building systems that understand adaptive behavior, are you referring to machine learning models that can predict and respond to changes in pattern recognition at the network level?" I felt my pulse quicken, This was the first time all evening that someone had asked a technical question that indicated they actually understood what I was trying to build. Yes, but more than that? I'm talking about systems that don't just respond to changes, they anticipate them. They model the meta patterns that drive adaptation itself. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. That would require processing capabilities that are significant. It would if you approached it with traditional architectures. But what if you designed the system to be distributed from the ground up? What if instead of building one massive central processor, you created a network of smaller, specialized nodes that could each focus on specific pattern types while sharing information through a unified protocol? You're describing something like a neural mesh network, Dr. Chen said thoughtfully. But the coordination problems alone would be solvable, I finished. If you borrowed organizational principles from military command structures, hierarchical decision-making with autonomous units that can operate independently when communications are compromised but reintegrate seamlessly when connectivity is restored. The crowd around us had grown larger, drawn by the presence of Dr. Chen and the increasingly technical nature of our conversation. But the expressions on their faces had changed. The open mockery was gone, replaced by confusion, and, in some cases, what looked like genuine curiosity. Marcus, however, wasn't ready to let go of his certainty. This all sounds very impressive, Maya, but you're still talking about theoretical concepts. Where's your proof of concept? Where are your test results? I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I'd experienced during every pitch meeting when the questions shifted from technical feasibility to practical demonstration. I'm still in development phase. Development phase, Rebecca repeated, her confidence returning. Dr. Chen, I'm sure you can appreciate the difference between having interesting ideas about AI architecture and actually building functional systems. What Ms. Rodriguez is describing sounds fascinating in theory, but theory and implementation are very different things. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. That's certainly true. The gap between conceptual framework and working code is often where promising ideas fail. She turned back to me. Ms. Rodriguez, have you built any working prototypes? Even simple demonstrations of the core concepts? The question hung in the air like a sword. This was the moment I dreaded in every pitch meeting, the inevitable request for concrete proof that my ideas were more than just elaborate fantasies. I thought about my studio apartment, about the servers humming in my bedroom, about the 18 months of 16-hour days I'd spent turning theoretical models into actual code. I have built something, I said carefully, but it's not ready for public demonstration. Marcus laughed, the sound harsh in the suddenly quiet ballroom. Of course it's not ready. It's never ready, is it, Maya? There's always another feature to add, another algorithm to refine, another excuse for why you can't actually show anyone what you've built. Jennifer Walsh leaned in with her recorder again. Ms. Rodriguez, can you at least describe what your prototype does? What kind of results have you achieved in testing? I felt trapped between honesty and self-preservation. The truth was that my prototype was working, better than I'd dared to hope when I'd started. But it was also fragile, still dependent on my constant monitoring and adjustment. It wasn't ready for the kind of scrutiny that would come with public demonstration, especially not in front of an audience that was looking for reasons to dismiss it. I can't discuss specific performance metrics, I said, but I can say that the core algorithmic approach is proving viable. Can't or won't? Rebecca asked sharply. Because there's a difference between protecting intellectual property and having nothing to protect. The accusation stung because it echoed my own worst fears. What if I was deluding myself? What if the results I'd been seeing were just artifacts of limited testing, problems that would become obvious the moment I tried to scale beyond my carefully controlled environment? This is exactly what I'm talking about, Marcus said to the crowd, his voice taking on the tone of someone making an important point. 18 months of development, claims about revolutionary technology, and when we ask for the most basic demonstration of functionality, we get evasions and excuses. It's not uncommon for early-stage development to be secretive, Dr. Chen said diplomatically, particularly when the underlying technology could have significant commercial value. But it's also not uncommon for early-stage development to be non-existent, Rebecca countered. Dr. Chen, you've seen dozens of startups pitch similar ideas. How many of them actually had working technology versus how many were essentially elaborate business plans built around theoretical concepts? Dr. Chen considered the question carefully. The majority of early-stage AI startups are indeed more concept than implementation. The technical challenges are significant, and the resources required for proper development are often underestimated. I felt the crowd's attention shift back to me, their skepticism reinforced by Dr. Chen's measured assessment. These were people who dealt with ambitious claims and undelivered promises every day. They'd learned to distinguish between substance and smoke, and from their perspective, I was looking more and more like the latter. The resources issue is particularly relevant here, said the woman in silver. Ms. Rodriguez, you mentioned working alone in your apartment. Can you help us understand how you've been funding this development? Because building the kind of technology you're describing would typically require significant capital investment. The question felt like a trap, but it was a fair one. How do you explain that you've been living on military disability payments and freelance consulting work? How do you admit that your development budget consists of whatever you can scrape together? After rent and groceries? I've been bootstrapping, I said simply. Bootstrapping, Marcus repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of that approach. Maya, do you have any idea what companies like Google and Amazon spend on AI research annually? We're talking about budgets in the hundreds of millions, teams of world-class researchers, access to computational resources that cost more per month than most people make in a year. And you think you can compete with that from your apartment? Rebecca added, her voice carrying a finality that suggested the conversation was essentially over. With no funding, no team, no infrastructure, and no demonstrable results. The silence that followed Rebecca's final dismissal felt like the moment after an explosion, when the smoke is still settling and everyone is waiting to see who's left standing. I could feel the crowd's attention beginning to drift, their interest in my public humiliation fading as the novelty wore off. Several people had already started turning away, moving toward the bar or gravitating toward other conversations that promised to be more productive uses of their time. But then I heard footsteps approaching from behind me, deliberate and measured. The sound made several people in the crowd look up with expressions of curiosity and, in some cases, recognition. I turned to see a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit making his way through the gathering, his presence causing a subtle but noticeable shift in the dynamics of our circle. David Kim had the kind of face that appeared on magazine covers and conference panels, the silver-haired gravitas that came with building 3 successful companies and serving on the boards of a dozen others. His venture capital firm, Meridian Partners, had funded some of the most successful tech startups of the past decade. More importantly for my current situation, he was one of the 3 investors who had passed on my pitch just 2 months earlier. Ms. Rodriguez, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. Rebecca's expression brightened immediately. David Kim's attention was valuable currency in this room, and having him join our discussion elevated its importance considerably. David, perfect timing. We were just discussing the challenges facing aspiring entrepreneurs who might be overestimating their capabilities. David nodded thoughtfully, his eyes moving between Rebecca and me. Indeed, it's a common problem in our industry, the gap between ambition and execution. He paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Ms. Rodriguez, I believe we met recently? We did, I said carefully. Meridian Partners, Conference Room C, September 15th. Ah, yes. David said, his tone neutral, but carrying undertones I couldn't quite read. Your presentation on adaptive logistics algorithms. Quite ambitious. Marcus perked up immediately. You pitched to Meridian? Maya, you didn't mention that earlier. You didn't ask, I replied, feeling defensive. Jennifer Walsh stepped closer with her recorder, sensing that this development might be significant. Mr. Kim, can you share your assessment of Ms. Rodriguez's proposal? What were the concerns that led to Meridian's decision to pass? David's smile was enigmatic. Well, as I recall, the primary concerns were around scalability and market validation. Ms. Rodriguez was proposing to solve problems that existing solutions already address adequately, using methods that were, let's say, unproven. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I felt my cheeks burn. Having my rejection dissected in public was even more humiliating than I'd expected. The crowd leaned in, feeding off the second-hand embarrassment of watching someone's failures exposed by the very people who had rejected them. But, David continued, his tone shifting slightly, I have to admit that something about that presentation has been bothering me ever since. The word bothering hung in the air like a question mark. Rebecca's confident expression flickered for just a moment. Bothering you how? Dr. Chen asked, her scientific curiosity overriding social niceties. David turned his attention back to me, his gaze intense and searching. Ms. Rodriguez, during your presentation, you mentioned a specific case study. Something about optimizing delivery routes for a humanitarian aid organization in Somalia. You claimed your algorithm had reduced delivery time by 37%, while cutting fuel costs by 22%. I nodded, unsure where this was heading. That's correct. And you said this was a consulting project you'd completed 6 months earlier? Yes. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out, his phone scrolling through what appeared to be emails or documents. The reason that's been bothering me is that 3 weeks after our meeting, I had dinner with Margaret Sullivan, who runs logistics for International Relief Consortium. We were discussing various technology partnerships, and she mentioned that they'd recently worked with a consultant who had achieved remarkable results optimizing their Somalia operations. The crowd had grown completely silent now, everyone hanging on David's words. 37% reduction in delivery time, David continued, reading from his phone. 22% reduction in fuel costs. She said it was the most effective optimization they'd ever implemented, and that the consultant had refused any payment beyond covering their expenses. I felt my heart start to race. I'd never mentioned the pro bono nature of that work during my pitch, never explained that I'd done it primarily to test my algorithms in a real-world environment. She also mentioned, David said, his voice growing more thoughtful, that the consultant had predicted their results with remarkable accuracy. Before implementation, they'd projected 35 to 40% improvement in delivery time and 20 to 25% reduction in fuel costs. The actual results fell right in the middle of those ranges. Marcus frowned. I don't understand. What does this have to do with Maya's pitch to you? It has to do with the fact that when someone can predict the performance of complex systems, with that level of accuracy, it suggests their underlying models are quite sophisticated. David's eyes remained fixed on me. Ms. Rodriguez, you said during your presentation that this was just one example of several consulting projects you'd completed. How many organizations have you worked with? The question felt like stepping onto thin ice. I'd been deliberately vague about my consulting work during the pitch, partly because much of it had been pro bono or low-paid projects that didn't sound impressive when described in financial terms. 17 different organizations, I said quietly, over the past 14 months. 17, David repeated, his eyebrows rising slightly. And what were the average improvements in efficiency? It varied depending on the complexity of their existing systems and the scope of optimization they were willing to implement. But typically between 25 and 40% improvement in key metrics. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her academic interest clearly piqued. Ms. Rodriguez, that's a remarkable success rate. Have you published any of these results? Presented them at conferences? No, I said. Most of my clients were nonprofit organizations or small businesses. They weren't interested in publicity, just solutions. Small businesses and nonprofits, Rebecca said, her tone suggesting these were somehow less legitimate than corporate clients. That's quite different from the enterprise-level applications you described in your pitch presentations. Is it? David asked, his question directed at Rebecca, but his eyes still on me. Ms. Rodriguez, what was the largest organization you worked with? I hesitated. The answer would either strengthen my credibility or expose the gap between my actual experience and my ambitious claims. The logistics network for the Pacific Northwest Food Bank Consortium. They coordinate distribution for 43 different food banks across 3 states. That's not exactly small scale, Dr. Chen observed. How many delivery routes were you optimizing? Approximately 2,000 active routes per week, with seasonal variations that could double that number during peak demand periods. David's expression had shifted from skeptical curiosity to something more intense. 2,000 routes per week, and you achieved what level of improvement? 41% reduction in total vehicle miles traveled, 33% improvement in on-time deliveries, 27% reduction in fuel costs. The numbers rolled off my tongue because I'd lived with them for months, tracked them obsessively, celebrated every incremental improvement. Those are extraordinary results, Dr. Chen said, her tone suggesting she was beginning to reassess her initial impressions. But Rebecca wasn't ready to concede ground. Even if we accept these numbers at face value, there's still a massive difference between optimizing existing delivery networks and building a company that can compete with established players in the logistics industry. Absolutely, Marcus agreed, seeming relieved to find familiar footing. Maya, even if your consulting work has been successful, that doesn't mean you're ready to scale up to enterprise-level applications. The Food Bank Consortium might have 2,000 routes, but companies like FedEx and UPS are managing millions of packages per day across global networks. Which brings us back to the fundamental questions, said the woman in silver. Infrastructure, funding, scalability. How do you bridge the gap between successful small-scale consulting and building a technology company that can compete at the enterprise level? The questions felt like a coordinated attack, each one designed to expose the weaknesses in my position. But something had changed in the last few minutes. David Kim's revelation about my Somalia project had shifted the tenor of the conversation, introducing an element of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Those are fair questions, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And the answer is that you don't try to compete with FedEx and UPS directly. You build something they can't. Which is what exactly? David asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. I took a breath, feeling like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. You build systems that understand the difference between efficiency and resilience. You build networks that get stronger when they're stressed, instead of breaking down. You build solutions for the problems that traditional optimization can't solve. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could feel the weight of everyone's attention focusing on me with renewed intensity. David Kim's eyes narrowed with what I recognized as the focused attention of someone who had just heard something that challenged his assumptions. Ms. Rodriguez, when you say systems that get stronger when stressed, are you referring to anti-fragile architectures, networks, that actually improve their performance under adverse conditions? The reference to anti-fragility surprised me. Most venture capitalists I'd encountered were familiar with the business applications of the concept, but few understood its technical implications for system design. Yes, but not in the way most people think about it. traditional redundancy. Just duplicates existing pathways. True anti-fragile systems create new pathways in response to disruption. Can you give us a concrete example? Dr. Chen asked, her academic curiosity overriding the social dynamics of the conversation. I glanced around the circle, aware that I was about to venture into territory that would either legitimize my claims or expose their limitations. 3. Months ago, a wildfire shut down Interstate 5 between Portland and Seattle for 6 days. The Food Bank Consortium's normal distribution network was completely disrupted. Their existing backup routes would have increased delivery time by 200% and fuel costs by 150%. But your system handled it differently? David prompted. My system didn't just find alternate routes, it restructured the entire network topology in real time, creating temporary distribution hubs, coordinating with local volunteer networks, and establishing new delivery patterns that were actually more efficient than the original system. I paused, remembering the 72 hours I'd spent monitoring the adaptation, watching my algorithms respond to the crisis with solutions I hadn't explicitly programmed. When the interstate reopened, they kept using the new network architecture because it was performing 23% better than their previous system. Rebecca's expression had shifted from dismissive to cautious. That's an impressive anecdote, Maya, but crisis response and systematic optimization are very different challenges. You're talking about one-off solutions to specific problems. Am I? I asked, feeling something shift in my chest, a familiar confidence that came from knowing I was finally on solid ground. David, you mentioned that my Somalia predictions were unusually accurate. Do you know why? David shook his head, his attention completely focused on me now. Because I wasn't optimizing for the conditions that existed when I built the model. I was optimizing for the conditions that would exist after the optimization was implemented. I turned to address the wider circle, feeling the energy in the room change as people leaned in despite themselves. Traditional algorithms assume static environments. They find the best solution for current conditions and hope those conditions don't change. But real systems are dynamic. They evolve. The act of optimization itself changes the environment. Marcus frowned. That sounds like circular logic. How can you optimize for conditions that don't exist yet? By modeling the metadynamics of adaptation, I said, my voice gaining strength as I moved into territory I'd spent 18 months exploring. Every system exists within larger systems. Every optimization creates ripple effects. Traditional algorithms ignore those ripple effects, which is why most efficiency improvements plateau after initial implementation. But your approach accounts for those ripple effects? Dr. Chen asked. My approach treats them as features, not bugs. When you improve delivery efficiency in one area, you change traffic patterns, which affects other delivery routes, which creates new opportunities for optimization, which changes customer behavior patterns, which opens up entirely new possibilities. I realized I was speaking faster now, my hands moving as I tried to illustrate concepts that were clearer in my mind than in words. It's not about finding the optimal solution. It's about building systems that continuously discover better solutions. Jennifer Walsh had been scribbling notes frantically, her recorder capturing every word. Ms. Rodriguez, this sounds incredibly complex. How do you prevent the system from becoming unstable? From chasing optimization loops that never converge? Question demonstrated a level of technical understanding I hadn't expected from a journalist. You build in stability constraints based on biological models. Natural systems solve this problem constantly. They optimize continuously without becoming unstable because they have inherent mechanisms that prevent runaway feedback loops. You're biomimicking evolutionary algorithms, David said, his tone shifting from curious to intrigued. More than that, I'm biomimicking evolutionary meta-algorithms, systems that evolve their own optimization strategies. I paused, realizing I was approaching the edge of what I could explain without revealing the specific architecture I'd spent so much time developing. Think about how immune systems work. They don't just respond to threats. They remember threats, anticipate variations, and develop increasingly sophisticated responses over time. The woman in silver who had been questioning me earlier looked confused. I'm afraid I don't follow the connection between immune systems and logistics optimization. Dr. Chen stepped in before I could answer. She's describing adaptive systems that learn from their own optimization processes. Each improvement becomes training data for the next iteration of improvement. In theory, such systems could continuously evolve better solutions without human intervention. In theory, Rebecca emphasized, but the computational requirements for that kind of continuous meta-optimization would be enormous. You'd need massive, parallel processing capabilities, real-time data integration from hundreds of sources, and algorithmic frameworks that don't exist in any current commercial applications. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest as the conversation shifted back to practical limitations. This was always where my explanations fell apart in pitch meetings, where theoretical elegance collided with resource constraints and implementation realities. Unless, David said slowly, his voice thoughtful, you designed the system to be distributed from the ground up. Ms. Rodriguez, earlier you mentioned borrowing organizational principles from military command structures. Can you elaborate on that? I glanced around the circle, aware that I was about to reveal more about my approach than I'd shared in any previous pitch. Military organizations have solved the computational distribution problem at scale. They coordinate complex operations across thousands of autonomous units using hierarchical decision-making frameworks that remain functional even when communication networks are compromised. You're talking about mesh networks with hierarchical coordination protocols, Dr. Chen said, her eyes lighting up with recognition. Each node capable of independent operation but sharing information through redundant pathways. Exactly. But instead of coordinating human units, you're coordinating optimization processes. Each node focuses on specific pattern recognition tasks, while contributing to system-wide adaptation. I found myself sketching in the air, my hands tracing network topologies that existed more clearly in my imagination than in any diagram I could draw. When a local optimization succeeds, it propagates its methodology to similar nodes. When it fails, the failure mode becomes training data for the entire network. Marcus was shaking his head. Maya, you're describing science fiction. The coordination, overhead alone would consume any efficiency gains. And you still haven't addressed the fundamental question of how you've implemented any of this without the kind of resources that major corporations spend millions developing. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Around me, I could feel the crowd's attention focusing with laser intensity, waiting for me to either provide concrete proof of my claims or admit that I'd been spinning elaborate fantasies. But, before I could answer, David pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. Ms. Rodriguez, you mentioned the Pacific Northwest Food Bank Consortium. Can you give me the name of your contact there? The request caught me off guard. Sarah Martinez. She's the Regional Logistics Coordinator. David continued typing, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. I'm sending her a text right now. If your results are as impressive as you claim, she should be happy to verify them. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt every eye in the circle fixed on me, waiting to see whether my claims would survive contact with objective verification. My mouth felt dry, and I realized that this moment would either validate everything I'd been saying or expose me as exactly the kind of delusional dreamer Rebecca had suggested I was. The seconds stretched out like hours as David waited for his phone to buzz with a response. The entire circle had fallen into a silence so complete that I could hear the ambient sounds of the gala filtering in from the rest of the ballroom. Clinking glasses, distant laughter, the soft notes of the jazz quartet that seemed to be playing. In another world entirely. Rebecca crossed her arms, her expression suggesting she was already mentally preparing her vindication speech for when Sarah Martinez either didn't respond or contradicted my claims. Marcus had that same look I'd seen in countless meetings, the patient tolerance of someone waiting for an inevitable disappointment to play out. "You know," Jennifer Walsh said, breaking the silence, "this is quite unprecedented. I've covered hundreds of tech events, and I've never seen someone's claims fact-checked in real time at a networking gala." "Welcome to the new economy," said the woman in silver. "Due diligence happens everywhere now. There's no hiding behind polished presentations and theoretical models when someone can verify your results with a text message." I felt my hands start to sweat. Sarah Martinez and I had worked closely together for 3 months, but we hadn't spoken in over 6 weeks. What if she was traveling? What if she didn't remember the specific metrics I'd cited? What if David's text came across as intrusive or unprofessional and she simply chose not to respond? Dr. Chen seemed to sense my anxiety. "Ms. Rodriguez, regardless of the outcome here, I have to say that your technical description of adaptive meta-algorithms is quite sophisticated. Have you published any academic papers on your methodology?" "No," I said, my voice sounding strained. To my own ears. "I've been focused on implementation rather than publication." "That's a mistake," Marcus said immediately. "If you've actually developed breakthrough technology, you should be protecting your intellectual property through patents and publications. The fact that you haven't suggests either poor business judgment or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. "Or," David said without looking up from his phone, "it suggests someone who's more interested in building solutions than building reputation." The comment surprised me. In my experience, venture capitalists cared more about market positioning than technical elegance, more about scalability than innovation. But David's tone suggested something different, a recognition that resonated with my own motivations. "That's an interesting perspective," Rebecca said carefully. "But in the real world, technical innovation without strategic business development is just expensive research. Maya, even if your technology works exactly as described, how do you plan to bring it to market? What's your customer acquisition strategy? Your revenue model? Your competitive differentiation?" The rapid-fire questions felt like artillery bombardment, each one designed to expose a different weakness in my business planning. And the truth was, they hit their targets. I'd spent 18 months perfecting my algorithms and testing them, with small organizations, but I'd barely thought about marketing strategies or sales processes. "I'm building something that works," I said, aware of how inadequate that sounded. "The business model will follow from the technology." "That's exactly backwards," said the woman in silver. "Technology follows market demand, not the other way. Around? You need to understand what customers want before you build solutions." "But what if customers don't know what they want?" I asked. "What if they're so accustomed to the limitations of existing systems that they can't imagine better alternatives?" Marcus laughed. "Maya, that's the kind of thinking that leads to products nobody wants. Customers may not be able to articulate their needs perfectly, but they understand their pain points. They know when systems aren't working for them." "Do they?" I challenged. "How many organizations accept 40% delivery failure rates because that's just how logistics works? How many companies budget for 20% waste because inefficiency is built into their operational assumptions?" Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "There's actually substantial research supporting Ms. Rodriguez's point. Many organizations have adapted their processes around systemic inefficiencies to the point where they don't recognize those inefficiencies as problems to be solved." "That may be true in academic theory," Rebecca said, "but it doesn't change the practical reality that you need paying customers to build a sustainable business. Maya, who exactly is going to buy your technology, and how much are they willing to pay for improvements to systems they don't think are broken?" Before I could answer, David's phone buzzed. The sound cut through our conversation like a gunshot, and every eye in the circle immediately focused on his screen. He read silently for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. Well? Marcus asked finally. David looked up at me, then at the crowd. Sarah Martinez confirms the metrics Ms. Rodriguez cited. 41% reduction in vehicle miles, 33% improvement in on-time deliveries, 27% reduction in fuel costs. He paused, scrolling through what appeared to be a longer message. She also says, and I quote, "Maya's work was transformational for our operations. We've had 3 other consultants try to optimize our network since then, and none of them came close to matching her results." The silence that followed was different from the expectant quiet we'd maintained while waiting for the response. This was the silence of people recalibrating their assumptions, processing information that didn't fit their existing frameworks. Jennifer Walsh was the first to speak. "Mr. Kim, is there more to the message?" David continued reading. "She says Maya refused payment for the optimization work, accepting only reimbursement for her travel expenses. And she asks if I know how to contact Maya because they have 2 partner organizations that want to implement similar solutions." Rebecca's confident expression had shifted to something more cautious. "That's certainly a strong endorsement, but it still doesn't address the fundamental scalability questions." "Actually," David said, his tone becoming more thoughtful, "it raises some interesting questions about scalability from a different angle. Ms. Rodriguez, Sarah mentions that you implemented this optimization in just 3 weeks. How is that possible when most logistics consulting projects take months or years?" I felt a spark of hope, the first genuine interest I'd heard from anyone all evening. Because I wasn't starting from scratch, I had already developed the core algorithms. The 3 weeks were spent adapting them to their specific network topology and data integration requirements. "You already had the algorithms," Dr. Chen repeated. "Ms. Rodriguez, how long have you been working on this technology?" 18 months of full-time development, but the theoretical foundation goes back to my military experience. I've been thinking about these problems for years. Marcus frowned. 18 months to develop something that can optimize complex logistics networks in 3 weeks? That seems unlikely. "Why?" I asked. "How long did it take you to build TechForward's optimization system? That's different. We were building enterprise-grade software with full compliance frameworks, security protocols, and user interfaces designed for non-technical operators." "Right. You were building a product. I was building a solution." I turned to address the wider group. Most optimization software is designed to be sold, not to be optimal. It has to work for every possible use case, which means it can't be perfect for any specific use case. David leaned forward, his attention sharpening. "You're saying your approach is more effective because it's more specialized?" "I'm saying my approach is more effective because it's designed to adapt. Instead of building one system that works adequately for everyone, I built a system that learns how to work optimally for each specific application." "But that would require—" Dr. Chen started, then stopped herself. "Ms. Rodriguez, are you saying you've developed a general-purpose optimization framework that can specialize itself for different applications?" The question hit closer to the core of my work than anything else I'd been asked all evening. "Not exactly. I've developed a framework that can evolve specialized optimization strategies based on the specific characteristics of each system it encounters." Rebecca shook her head. "That sounds like artificial general intelligence. Maya, you're claiming to have solved one of the most complex problems in computer science while working alone in your apartment." "I'm not claiming to have solved AGI," I said firmly. "I'm claiming to have solved adaptive optimization within the specific domain of logistics and resource allocation." "Which is still an extraordinary claim," Marcus pointed out. "Do you understand why people might be skeptical?" Before I could answer, David's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, then looked up with an expression of surprise. "Sarah sent a follow-up message. She says she's forwarded my contact information to her colleagues at 2 other organizations where Maya has done consulting work. They want to discuss potential partnerships." The revelation sent another ripple of recalibration through the crowd. These weren't just testimonials about past work. They were indications of ongoing demand for my services. "This is unprecedented," Jennifer Walsh murmured, her journalist instincts clearly engaged. "I've never seen real-time business development happen at a networking event." "It's not business development," I said quietly. "It's just people talking to each other about solutions that work." David's phone buzzed for a third time. This time, when he looked at the screen, his eyebrows rose noticeably. "Ms. Rodriguez? I'm getting a call from someone named Michael Thompson at Northwest Regional Transit. He says Sarah Martinez gave him my number and told him I was asking about your work." The crowd pressed closer as David answered the call, putting it on speaker after a brief exchange of pleasantries. Michael Thompson's voice came through clearly, carrying the slightly harried tone of someone who had been pulled away from other tasks. "Look, I don't know what your interest is in Maya Rodriguez," Michael was saying, "but I can tell you that woman is a genius. She saved our entire operation." Rebecca stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, this is Rebecca Martinez, CEO of TechForward. Can you elaborate on what you mean by saved your operation?" "Who am I speaking to?" Michael asked. "You're on speaker at an industry event," David explained. "Several of us are here discussing Ms. Rodriguez's work. Would you mind sharing your experience with her consulting?" There was a pause. Then Michael's voice returned with obvious enthusiasm. "Mind? Hell, I'd shout it from the rooftops if I thought it would get her to take on more clients. We're a mid-sized transit authority covering 6 counties. Before Maya, our bus routing system was a disaster. Constant delays, massive fuel waste, passenger complaints through the roof." Marcus leaned toward the phone. "What specifically did she do for you?" "Everything," Michael said emphatically. "But the remarkable thing wasn't just the optimization. It was how fast she understood our system. Most consultants spend weeks just figuring out how our operations work. Maya walked in, spent 2 days writing routes and talking to drivers, then came back with a complete analysis that identified problems we didn't even know we had." Dr. Chen moved closer to the phone. "Can you quantify the improvements you saw?" "Quantify? Lady, she transformed our entire operation. Route efficiency improved by 38%. On-time performance went from 62% to 91%. Fuel costs dropped by 29%. But here's the kicker. Passenger satisfaction scores increased by 45% because people could actually rely on our schedules." The numbers hit the crowd like physical impacts. These weren't theoretical projections or carefully qualified estimates. They were concrete results from a real organization with measurable outcomes. "Mr. Thompson," Rebecca said, her voice carefully controlled, "those are impressive numbers. How long did this optimization process take?" Implementation was about 4 weeks, but Maya had the solution designed in less than 2 weeks. I've never seen anything like it. She didn't just reorganize our existing routes. She completely reimagined how public transit could work in our service area. Jennifer Walsh held her recorder closer to the phone. "Can you describe what made her approach different from other consultants you'd worked with?" Michael laughed. "Other consultants looked at our system and tried to make it more efficient. Maya looked at our system and asked why we were using that system in the first place. She started from scratch, building routes based on actual passenger demand patterns instead of the historical routes we'd been tweaking for decades. But surely that kind of fundamental restructuring created significant disruption?" asked the woman in silver. "That's what we expected," Michael admitted. "But Maya had this incredible transition plan. She phased in the new routes gradually, monitoring performance at each stage, making adjustments in real time. By the time we fully implemented the new system, our drivers and passengers had already adapted to it." David leaned toward the phone. "Mr. Thompson, this is David Kim from Meridian Partners. I'm curious about the sustainability of these improvements. How long ago did Ms. Rodriguez complete her work with you?" "About 8 months ago. And here's the thing. The system keeps getting better. She built in some kind of adaptive mechanism. that continues optimizing based on changing conditions. We had a major construction project that shut down 3 key routes last month, and the system automatically restructured around it. Our performance actually improved during the disruption. The revelation sent another wave of surprise through the crowd. Self-improving systems that performed better under stress weren't just theoretical concepts. They were functioning realities in Michael Thompson's transit network. "That's impossible," Marcus said flatly. "Adaptive systems require constant monitoring and adjustment. You can't just implement an optimization and expect it to keep improving without ongoing technical support." "Tell that to our system," Michael replied with amusement. "Look, I don't understand the technical details. All I know is that Maya built something that works better now than when she first implemented it, and we haven't needed any technical support since the initial deployment." Dr. Chen stepped closer to the phone, her scientific skepticism clearly engaged. "Mr. Thompson, are you saying the system makes optimization decisions independently, without human oversight?" "Not exactly. It flags significant changes for our review, and we can override any recommendations we don't like. But in 8 months, we've never needed to override anything. The system's suggestions have always improved our performance." Rebecca's expression had shifted from dismissive to deeply concerned. If Michael Thompson's claims were accurate, they represented technology that was years ahead of anything currently available in the market. "Mr. Thompson, has Ms. Rodriguez shared her methodology with you? Do you understand how the adaptive mechanisms work? She gave us documentation that our IT team could understand, but honestly, most of it's over our heads. What matters to us is that it works, and it keeps working better." "Mr. Thompson," David said, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone exploring a business opportunity, "would you be willing to provide a more detailed analysis of your results? Performance data, cost savings, operational metrics?" "Already ahead of you," Michael replied. "When Sarah Martinez called me an hour ago, she said you might be interested in verification. I'm sending you our quarterly performance reports right now. You'll see the before and after numbers for yourself." The sound of David's phone receiving multiple emails was audible through the speaker. He quickly glanced at his screen, then looked up at me with an expression that had shifted from skeptical curiosity to something approaching amazement. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said slowly, "I'm looking at transit performance data that shows operational improvements that shouldn't be possible with current technology." "Define shouldn't be possible," I said quietly. 45% improvement in passenger satisfaction while reducing operational costs by 29%. Those metrics typically move in opposite directions. Better service usually costs more money. "Not if you're optimizing for the right variables," I replied. Michael Thompson's voice came through the speaker again. "That's exactly what Maya told us. She said most optimization focuses on minimizing costs or maximizing efficiency, but the real opportunity is in maximizing value. Different concept entirely." Dr. Chen was shaking her head in apparent disbelief. "Ms. Rodriguez, what you're describing sounds like multi-objective optimization with dynamic weighting. The computational complexity alone should make real-time implementation impossible." "Should," I agreed. "If you're using traditional computational approaches." "What approach are you using?" Dr. Chen asked. Before I could answer, David's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, then looked up with surprise. "It's someone from Cascade Logistics. They're asking about Maya Rodriguez." The crowd had grown substantially during our conversation. Word was spreading through the gala that something significant was happening, and more people were gravitating toward our discussion. I could see faces I recognized from industry publications, executives from major companies, academics from local universities. Rebecca stepped forward, her expression now showing genuine alarm. "David, before you take that call, I think we need to step back and consider what's really happening here. We have extraordinary claims being supported by anecdotal evidence from small organizations. This could be an elaborate setup. Setup for what? Marcus asked. Think about it, Rebecca said, her voice taking on an urgent tone. Maya shows up at this gala knowing she'll encounter skepticism. She makes incredible claims about her technology. Then, conveniently, people start calling to verify her work just as we're questioning her credibility. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Around me, I could see doubt creeping back into faces that had begun to show genuine interest. Rebecca's suggestion was paranoid, but it wasn't entirely unreasonable. The timing was remarkably convenient. You think I orchestrated this? I asked, my voice carrying an edge I couldn't suppress. I think you're either incredibly lucky or incredibly manipulative, Rebecca replied. And in my experience, luck this convenient is usually something else entirely. David looked between Rebecca and me, clearly trying to process the implications of what she was suggesting. Ms. Rodriguez, I have to ask, did you know I would be here tonight? Did you know we would have this conversation? The question felt like a trap, but it was a fair one. How do you prove that genuine coincidences aren't elaborate deceptions? I bought my ticket to this gala 3 weeks ago, I said, pulling out my phone to show the confirmation email. The same day I saw the announcement in the Tech Tribune. I came here because I thought it would be good networking, not because I expected to run into you or anyone else from Meridian Partners. David examined my phone screen, then handed it to Jennifer Walsh, who verified the timestamp on the email. Purchase date shows October 23rd, she confirmed. That's before Mr. Kim's schedule would have been finalized for this event. Rebecca wasn't backing down. That proves when she bought the ticket, not whether she knew who would be attending. These industry events publish speaker lists and major attendees weeks in advance. Actually, said a new voice from the edge of our crowd, they don't. Everyone turned to see Patricia Chen, the event organizer, approaching with a tablet in her hand. She was a small woman with an authoritative presence, the kind of person who could coordinate complex logistics while making it look effortless. I couldn't help overhearing your discussion, Patricia continued. For security and privacy reasons, we don't publish attendee lists for this event. Even our speakers are only confirmed publicly 48 hours in advance. She glanced at her tablet. Ms. Rodriguez purchased a general admission ticket 3 weeks ago. Mr. Kim's attendance was only confirmed on Tuesday. The revelation deflated Rebecca's conspiracy theory, but she regrouped quickly. Even if the timing is coincidental, we're still dealing with extraordinary claims that conveniently can't be verified through normal channels. Maya, if your technology is as revolutionary as you claim, why haven't you pursued traditional funding? Why the secrecy around your methods? Before I could answer, David's phone rang again. He glanced at the screen, then looked up with an expression of bewilderment. It's James Morrison from Pacific Freight Solutions. He says he got my number from Michael Thompson, who got it from Sarah Martinez. The crowd pressed closer as David answered the call, his skepticism clearly warring with curiosity. Mr. Morrison, you're on speaker at an industry event. We're discussing Maya Rodriguez's consulting work. Maya Rodriguez? James Morrison's voice came through clearly, carrying obvious excitement. Thank God someone's finally talking about her. Work publicly. I've been trying to convince my industry contacts to hire her for months, but she keeps turning down projects. Marcus stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, can you describe your experience with Ms. Rodriguez? Best investment we ever made, James replied immediately. We're a mid-sized freight company, about 200 trucks, covering the Pacific Northwest. Before Maya, we were hemorrhaging money on inefficient routes and missed deliveries. Our customer satisfaction was in the toilet. What specific improvements did you see? Dr. Chen asked. 34% reduction in fuel costs, 41% improvement in on-time deliveries, and a 57% increase in customer satisfaction scores. But those numbers don't tell the whole story. Maya didn't just optimize our existing operations. She fundamentally changed how we think about logistics. Jennifer Walsh leaned toward the phone. Can you elaborate on that? Traditional optimization tries to minimize costs or maximize efficiency within existing frameworks. Maya's approach throws out the frameworks entirely. She asked us why we were organizing our operations around truck capacity instead of customer needs, why we were optimizing for distance instead of value delivery. Questions that seemed obvious once she asked them, but nobody had ever asked them before. Rebecca's expression had shifted from skeptical to deeply troubled. Mr. Morrison, these improvements you're describing, how sustainable have they proven to be? That's the remarkable thing, James replied. It's been 6 months since implementation, and our performance keeps improving. Maya built some kind of learning system that adapts to changing conditions automatically. Last month, when that workers' strike shut down 3 major ports, our system rerouted everything through alternative distribution points. We actually improved our delivery times during what should have been a major disruption. The crowd around us had grown to nearly 50 people now, including several faces I recognized from magazine covers and conference panels. Word was spreading through the gala that something unprecedented was happening, and the most influential people in Seattle's tech scene were gravitating toward our discussion. David was scrolling through emails on his phone, his expression growing more amazed with each message he read. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm now receiving performance data from 4 different organizations, all confirming similar results. This level of consistent improvement across diverse applications suggests technology that's years ahead of current market solutions. Or, Rebecca said, her voice tight with frustration, it suggests coordinated misrepresentation of data. David, you're accepting these claims at face value without any independent verification. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her academic training clearly engaged. Ms. Rodriguez, I have to ask directly, are you claiming to have developed artificial general intelligence? Because what these testimonials describe sounds like AGI applications in logistics optimization. The question hit like a lightning bolt, cutting through all the peripheral discussions and focusing on the core technical issue that had been lurking beneath our entire conversation. AGI, artificial general intelligence, was the holy grail of computer science, the theoretical breakthrough that every major tech company was spending billions trying to achieve. I'm not claiming to have developed AGI, I said carefully. I'm claiming to have developed adaptive optimization systems that can evolve specialized strategies for specific domains. That's a distinction without a difference, Marcus said immediately. What you're describing is machine learning that can learn how to learn. That's essentially the definition of AGI. No, I replied, feeling my way through an explanation that had never been tested in public. AGI implies general intelligence across all domains. What I've built is specialized intelligence that can adapt within the specific domain of resource, allocation, and logistics optimization. Patricia Chen, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward with her tablet. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm looking at the attendee registration for this event. You listed your company as Adapt Logic Systems. Is that your startup? The question caught me off guard. I'd registered with that name because I'd needed something for the company field, but I'd never actually incorporated or formally established the business. It's the working name for my technology development. Working name, Rebecca seized on immediately. So you don't actually have a company. You don't have formal business structure, intellectual property protection, or legal framework for commercializing whatever technology you claim to have developed. Her observation was accurate and damaging. I'd been so focused on building and testing my algorithms that I'd neglected the business infrastructure that would be necessary for scaling beyond consulting projects. That's correct, I admitted. I've been focused on proving the technology works before investing in corporate infrastructure. Which brings us back to the fundamental question, said the woman in silver. Maya, even if we accept that your technology works as described, how do you plan to transition from informal consulting to building a scalable business? What's your strategy for competing with established players who have billions in resources? Before I could answer, David's phone buzzed with what appeared to be a text message. He glanced at the screen, then looked up with an expression of complete astonishment. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said slowly, "I just received a message from Margaret Sullivan at International Relief Consortium. She's asking if I know how to contact you because they want to discuss a potential partnership for scaling your optimization technology across their entire global network." The silence that followed was deafening. International Relief Consortium was one of the largest humanitarian organizations in the world, coordinating aid delivery across 6 continents with a logistics network that rivaled major corporations. Jennifer. Walsh was frantically taking notes. "Mr. Kim, can you share the specific details of that message?" David read from his phone. "She says they've been monitoring the performance improvements from Maya's Somalia project for 8 months. The efficiency gains have been so significant that they want to implement similar optimization across all their operations. She's asking about licensing agreements and implementation timelines." Rebecca's face had gone pale. "David, you're talking about a potential client that could generate tens of millions in revenue if Maya's technology can actually deliver the results they're expecting." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. If International Relief Consortium was seriously considering licensing my technology for global implementation, it suggested validation at a scale that would transform my informal consulting into a major business opportunity. "Ms. Rodriguez," Dr. Chen said quietly, "I think we need to have a very different conversation about your work." The transformation in the room's energy was palpable. What had begun as a public humiliation had evolved into something entirely different, a recognition that the assumptions everyone had made about me, about my capabilities, about my technology, might have been fundamentally wrong. David lowered his phone and looked directly at me. "Ms. Rodriguez, I think it's time we had a more serious conversation. Would you be willing to meet with my team next week to discuss potential investment opportunities?" The offer hung in the air like a bridge I'd been trying to build for 18 months. But even as I felt a surge of vindication, Rebecca stepped forward with one final challenge. "David, before you commit to anything, I think we all need to see actual proof of concept. Maya, you've given us impressive testimonials and performance data, but you still haven't demonstrated your technology directly. Can you show us how it actually works?" The request was reasonable, but it also represented my greatest vulnerability. My algorithms were elegant in theory and effective in practice, but they weren't packaged for demonstration. They existed as custom implementations running on servers in my apartment, adapted specifically for each client's unique requirements. "I can't run a live demonstration without access to real operational data," I said carefully. "The system needs actual logistics networks to optimize. It's not a simulation. It's a tool for optimizing real-world complexity." Marcus seized on this immediately. "So you're saying we just have to take your word for it? That's not how technology investment works, Maya. Investors need to see working prototypes." Before I could respond, Patricia Chen stepped forward again, her tablet in hand. "Actually, I might be able to help with that." She turned to address the crowd. "The catering logistics for this event are managed through a digital platform that tracks delivery routes, timing, and resource allocation in real time. If Ms. Rodriguez is willing, we could use our event logistics as a test case." The suggestion sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Here was an opportunity for immediate, observable demonstration using real operational data with measurable outcomes. "That's brilliant," Dr. Chen said. "Ms. Rodriguez, would you be willing to analyze the catering logistics for this event? Show us how your optimization approach would improve efficiency." I felt my pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes public demonstration that could either validate my claims or expose their limitations. But it was also an opportunity to show my technology in action rather than just describing it in theoretical terms. "I'd need access to the operational data," I said. "Delivery schedules, resource allocation, route planning, timing constraints." Patricia nodded. "I can provide all of that. We have real-time dashboards tracking every aspect of event logistics. She paused, then smiled. And if your optimization actually improves our operations, it could save us significant money on future events. Jennifer Walsh stepped closer with her recorder. This is unprecedented. I've never seen a technology demonstration happen spontaneously at a networking event. David pulled out his business card and handed it to me. Ms. Rodriguez, regardless of how this demonstration goes, I want to schedule a formal meeting. What we've heard tonight suggests technology with significant commercial potential. But Rebecca wasn't finished. David, before you commit to anything, consider what happens if this demonstration fails. If Maya's technology doesn't deliver the improvements she's claiming, it suggests that all these testimonials might be less reliable than they appear. The challenge was clear. This demonstration would either validate my claims definitively or undermine them completely. There would be no middle ground, no room for qualified success or partial validation. I understand the stakes, I said quietly. I'm willing to proceed. Patricia gestured toward a quiet corner of the ballroom where several laptops were set up for event coordination. We can use the logistics station over there. I'll pull up our operational dashboards and current performance metrics. As we moved toward the laptops, the crowd followed, growing larger as word spread that something significant was happening. I found myself at the center of a circle that now included some of the most influential people in Seattle's tech ecosystem. Patricia quickly logged into the event management system, revealing a complex dashboard showing delivery routes, timing schedules, resource allocation, and real-time performance metrics. Here's our current setup, she explained. We're managing catering delivery to 12 different areas of the hotel, coordinating with kitchen schedules, service staff rotations, and guest flow patterns. I studied the data, feeling the familiar rush of pattern recognition as my mind began processing the relationships between variables. Can you show me the historical performance data? I need to understand the baseline efficiency before proposing optimizations. Of course. Patricia navigated to historical reports showing delivery times, resource utilization, staff allocation, and guest satisfaction metrics from previous events. As I analyzed the data, I became aware of the absolute silence around me. 50 of the most successful people in Seattle's tech industry were watching me work, waiting to see whether I could deliver on months of accumulated promises. I see several optimization opportunities, I said after 10 minutes of analysis. Your current system is optimized for resource utilization, but it's creating inefficiencies in guest experience and staff workflow. Can you be more specific? Dr. Chen asked. I turned the laptop screen so the crowd could see the data visualizations I was creating. Your delivery routes minimize travel distance for catering staff, but they create bottlenecks during peak service. Periods. You're optimizing for efficiency instead of flow dynamics. Marcus leaned in to examine my analysis. What would you do differently? Reorganize the delivery schedule to optimize for guest experience while actually reducing total staff workload. I began sketching modifications to the logistics plan, explaining my reasoning as I worked. Instead of minimizing distance, we optimize for timing synchronization. Instead of maximizing resource utilization, we optimize for system resilience. That sounds like the same theoretical concepts you've been describing all evening, Rebecca said. Can you show us concrete improvements? Specific metrics that would be better under your approach? I spent another 15 minutes developing a complete alternative logistics plan, then turned the screen back toward the crowd. Under the current system, average delivery time is 14 minutes with 23% variance. Under the optimized approach, average delivery time would be 11 minutes with 8% variance. How can you be certain of those projections? Asked the woman in silver. Because they're not projections, I said. They're calculations based on the actual constraints and relationships in your system. The improvements I'm describing don't require new resources or major operational changes. They just require better coordination of existing resources. Patricia studied my proposed changes, her expression growing more interested as she worked through the implications. Ms. Rodriguez, this is fascinating. Your approach would actually reduce staff workload while improving service quality. Exactly. Most optimization treats efficiency and quality as trade-offs. But when you optimize for system dynamics instead of individual metrics, you often discover that apparent trade-offs are actually coordination problems. David was taking notes on his phone. Ms. Rodriguez, can this optimization approach be implemented immediately, tonight? I looked at Patricia, who was already nodding. We could implement the delivery schedule changes for the late evening service. It would give us real-time comparison data between the current approach and the optimized approach. Do it, Dr. Chen said immediately. This is exactly the kind of controlled experiment that would validate the methodology. Rebecca looked around the crowd, her expression suggesting she was trying to find reasons to object, but couldn't identify any legitimate concerns. Fine. But I want real-time monitoring of the results. If this optimization fails to deliver the promised improvements, I think we'll have our answer about the reliability of Maya's technology. Patricia was already implementing the changes in the event management system. The modified delivery schedule will take effect in 30 minutes for the evening dessert service. We'll have comparative data within 2 hours. Jennifer Walsh held her recorder. For the record, this may be the first time venture capital due diligence has been conducted through real-time logistics optimization at a networking gala. As Patricia finished implementing the changes, David turned to me with an expression that had shifted from skeptical curiosity to serious business interest. Ms. Rodriguez, assuming this demonstration succeeds, are you prepared to discuss scaling your technology? Because what I'm seeing suggests applications far beyond logistics consulting. The question represented everything I'd been working toward for 18 months. But even as I felt the satisfaction of finally being taken seriously, I realized that this moment, this validation, was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. I'm prepared to discuss whatever makes sense, I said simply. But I want to see how tonight's optimization performs first. The technology should speak for itself. Around me, the crowd waited with the same anticipation I'd felt countless times while watching my algorithms adapt to new challenges. But this time, instead of working alone in my apartment, I was surrounded by the very people who had dismissed my ambitions just hours earlier. The evening dessert service would either vindicate everything I'd built or expose the gap between my confidence and my capabilities. Either way, by morning, everything would be different. The dessert service results came in at 11:47 p.m. Patricia's voice cut through the crowd's anticipation. Average delivery time, 10.3 minutes. Variance, 6.2%. Guest satisfaction scores up 41% from our baseline. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the applause began. David Kim was already on his phone, scheduling meetings. Dr. Chen was asking about academic collaboration opportunities. Even Marcus approached me quietly, mentioning TechForward's interest in licensing discussions. But Rebecca surprised me most. Maya, she said, extending her hand, I owe you an apology, and probably a job offer. 6 months later, Adapt Logic Systems closed a Series A funding round led by Meridian Partners. Our optimization technology is now deployed across 17 major logistics networks, with International Relief Consortium serving as our flagship client. The Food Bank Consortium that started it all? They're now our head of client success. Jennifer. Walsh's article about that night, titled The Gala That Changed Everything, became the most read piece in Tech Tribune's history. She wrote, Sometimes revolution doesn't announce itself with presentations and pitch decks. Sometimes it walks into a room wearing clearance clothes and grandmother's pearls, then quietly proves that everything you thought you knew was wrong. Last. week, I received an invitation to keynote next year's Investor Gala. The theme? Recognizing hidden innovation. I'm wearing the same navy dress, the same pearls, because some things are worth remembering, especially the moment when the impossible became inevitable. The empire they laughed at? It bought more than just their company. It bought their respect, their attention, and their understanding that sometimes the best solutions come from the quietest voices. If stories of persistence and unexpected triumph inspire you, subscribe to our channel. Every week, we share real stories of people who turned their greatest challenges into their greatest victories. Hit that subscribe button. Your next breakthrough might be waiting in our next video.